The air was thick with the scent of lilies and burning incense. A suffocating blanket over the grieving faces gathered beneath the old church's wooden rafters. The pews were filled with friends and family dressed in black, their whispers drowned out by the somber melody of the organ. Every eye was fixed on the mahogany coffin at the altar's center, every eye, except for one. A small gray cat sat silently by the coffin's side, its emerald eyes locked on the polished wood with a strange, unsettling intensity. No one knew where it had come from. No one dared to move it away. Then, the silence shattered. A soft, drawn-out meow echoed through the church. Once, twice, a third time, each sound sharper, more desperate than the last. The mourners shifted uncomfortably, exchanging uneasy glances. Some muttered prayers under their breath. "Whose cat is this?" A man finally whispered from the back, his voice shaky but curious. The priest, who had been reciting a prayer, suddenly faltered. His hand trembled as he gripped the rosary tighter, beads pressing into his pale skin. Beads of sweat formed on his brow despite the cool air. That cat shouldn't be here," the priest stammered, eyes darting toward the door as if expecting something or someone to walk in. The man stepped closer to the coffin, frowning. "Why is it meowing like that? What's wrong with it?" The priest swallowed hard. "It's not the cat I'm worried about," he whispered. "It's what it remembers." And just like that, the atmosphere thickened with a fear no one could explain, but everyone could feel. The funeral was supposed to be simple: quiet prayers, final goodbyes, and a lowering of the coffin into the earth where it belonged. But nothing about this moment felt simple anymore. The cat's mournful cries had shifted the mood from grief to unease, like a forgotten memory clawing its way back to the surface. Thomas Whitaker, the man who had asked about the cat, couldn't tear his eyes away from it. The creature wasn't just mourning, it seemed to be warning them. Each soft meow echoed deeper than mere sadness. It carried the weight of something unspoken, something ancient. The priest, Father Edmund, wiped the sweat from his forehead with a trembling hand. His voice, once steady with years of practice, cracked as he resumed the service. "We gather here today to lay to rest Harold Blackwell, a beloved husband, brother, and friend." Thomas's gaze flickered toward the coffin. He had known Harold, only through brief encounters. A quiet man, kind but distant, who seemed to carry shadows in his eyes even on the brightest days. Yet something about this entire ceremony felt wrong. The cat meowed again, softer now, almost as if pleading. "Do you know who owns the cat?" Thomas whispered to Marla, Harold's niece, who stood beside him clutching a damp tissue. She shook her head quickly, dabbing at her eyes. No. Uncle Harold didn't even like cats. He was allergic. Thomas's frown deepened. If it wasn't Harold's, then why was it here? And why did it seem so attached to him even in death? Father Edmund cleared his throat, trying to steady his voice as he continued reading the scripture. But his hands trembled with every passing second, and his eyes kept darting toward the animal, as though he knew something the rest of them didn't. When the service ended, the mourners began to leave quietly, exchanging hugs and whispered condolences. The cat, however, remained firmly rooted by the coffin, now silent but alert, its green eyes burning holes into the polished wood. Thomas couldn't let it go. His curiosity, mixed with a growing sense of dread, forced him to approach Father Edmund before the priest could retreat into the sacristy. "Father," Thomas called softly, "why were you so nervous during the service?" The priest hesitated for a beat too long. His eyes, heavy with something like guilt, or was it fear, met Thomas's. "It's nothing for you to worry about, son." "Nothing?" Thomas stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You were shaking. You couldn't even look at the coffin. And that cat, what's going on here?" Father Edmund exhaled slowly, the weight of his secrets pressing visibly on his shoulders. "Some things are better left buried, Mr. Whitaker. Harold was involved in matters that went beyond this world's understanding." Thomas felt a chill creep up his spine. What kind of matters? Before the priest could answer, the cat suddenly hissed, low and guttural. Both men turned sharply toward the coffin. The air around them seemed to thicken, the late afternoon sunlight bleeding unnaturally dim through the stained glass windows. Father Edmund's voice dropped to a whisper. "If that cat is here, it means he's not resting peacefully." The words hit Thomas like ice water. "You mean Harold?" The priest nodded grimly. Harold wasn't just a man. He was a keeper of something dangerous. And if the cat remembers him, then whatever Harold tried to take with him to the grave might not stay buried for long. Thomas's heart pounded. The funeral, the strange behavior of the priest, the cat's persistent presence, it all connected to a mystery far deeper than anyone there had realized. And this was only the beginning. The sun dipped behind thick clouds. As the last of the mourners left the cemetery, their footsteps fading into the distance. The soft rustling of wind through the trees was the only sound left, except for the cat's steady, low purring beside Harold's coffin. It no longer seemed like an innocent animal mourning its master. No, this was something different, something watching. Thomas lingered by the grave long after everyone else had gone, his curiosity now fully eclipsed by dread. He crouched down and reached out a tentative hand toward the cat. Surprisingly, it didn't shy away. Instead, it pressed its head against his fingers, purring softly, comforting, yet unnervingly cold to the touch. "What are you trying to tell me, little one?" Thomas whispered, brushing his hand through the cat's gray fur. Behind him, Father Edmund stood silently, his expression shadowed by fear. "You shouldn't stay here, Mr. Whitaker. If the cat remains, it means the barrier between life and death is thin." Thomas rose to his feet, narrowing his eyes. "You keep saying things like that. What exactly do you mean? What was Harold keeping?" The priest hesitated, glancing at the freshly dug grave. "There are old stories about your friend. He wasn't just an ordinary man. He studied forbidden things, ancient texts, rituals that could trap spirits or release them." Thomas's stomach tightened. "You think he was involved in some kind of dark magic?" The priest's silence was answer enough. Before Thomas could respond, the wind suddenly picked up, howling through the trees like a warning. The cat's eyes snapped open, now glowing faintly in the dim light. It turned its gaze toward the coffin, letting out a low, sorrowful moan that echoed unnaturally in the air. The ground beneath Thomas's feet seemed to tremble. Just a little. Just enough to notice. "We need to leave," Father Edmund urged, gripping Thomas's arm. "Now." But Thomas pulled away. "No, not until you tell me everything. What exactly did Harold do?" The priest looked like he might argue, but then his shoulders sagged. "Years ago, Harold found something he shouldn't have. A book older than any of us can comprehend. It was said to contain rituals that could bind souls, trap them in this world for eternity. He said he wanted to protect people from what was inside, but I feared he became obsessed with the power instead." Thomas swallowed hard. "So what? You think he trapped something, and now it's trying to get out?" Before Father Edmund could answer, a sharp crack split the air. Both men spun around, to see the coffin, Harold's coffin, shift slightly in the soft dirt. The cat let out a blood-curdling yowl. "Move!" the priest shouted, shoving Thomas back just as the ground split open with a sickening tear. Dirt collapsed inward, revealing a sudden gaping void beneath the coffin, far too deep for a simple grave. A freezing wind rushed out of the opening, carrying whispers that weren't made by anything human. "What is that?" Thomas gasped, his breath fogging in front of him despite the warm air. "The beginning of something terrible," Father Edmund said grimly. "We need to seal this now before it's too late." Suddenly a hand, gray, decayed, and clawed, shot out from the void, grasping at the coffin's edge. The cat hissed violently, fur bristling as it lunged forward, standing between Thomas and the hand like a guardian. "Help me," Father Edmund shouted, pulling out a small vial of holy water from his jacket. "We can't let him come back." But Thomas was frozen, his eyes locked on the withered hand as it clawed at the earth. The whispers grew louder, voices he didn't understand, speaking words that felt like knives in his mind. Thomas. The priest's voice cut through the chaos, snapping him back to reality. Without thinking, Thomas grabbed a handful of dirt and began shoving it back into the hole, his heart hammering like a war drum in his chest. The cat yowled again, and with one final desperate shriek, the hand was swallowed by the collapsing earth. The ground stilled. The whispers stopped, and then silence. Thomas collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath. What was that? Father Edmund knelt beside him, placing a steady hand on his shoulder. That wasn't Harold anymore, he said quietly. That was what he became. The priest glanced down at the cat now sitting calmly between them, its emerald eyes soft with sadness. And this little guardian, it wasn't just mourning, it was protecting us. Thomas looked back at the sealed grave, dread still curling in his stomach. Is it over? Father Edmund's silence was answer enough. No, this was just the beginning. The graveyard lay unnaturally still in the aftermath of the chaos. Though the ground had sealed itself and the whispers had faded, the weight of what had happened hung thick in the air, an oppressive silence, like the calm before a violent storm. The cat, once a mere onlooker in the eyes of the mourners, now felt like the only being that truly understood what was coming. It rubbed against Thomas's leg, eyes glowing faintly in the moonlight. Its soft purr a strange contrast to the fear clawing at his chest. Thomas turned to Father Edmund, who was already drawing strange symbols in the dirt with shaking hands. We sealed the grave, isn't that enough? The priest didn't look up. No, we've only delayed it. His voice was grim. That thing, the darkness Harold tried to contain, is bound to him. And if it was strong enough to reach out from the grave, it's strong enough to try again. The barrier is weak. Thomas's fists clenched. What do we do? Father Edmund's hands stilled. There's only one way to stop it for good. We have to destroy what remains of Harold's connection to this world. The book, his journals, anything tied to the rituals he performed. If we don't, that thing will keep clawing its way back through Harold's memory, through his body, or through us. Thomas swallowed hard, dread pooling in his stomach. Where's the book now? The priest hesitated. At Harold's house. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Harold's house, the place no one had dared to enter since his death, now loomed in Thomas's mind like a living nightmare. We have to go, Thomas said, his voice steady despite the fear in his chest. If we wait any longer, it might be too late. The priest nodded slowly. But we won't go alone. Thomas followed his gaze. The cat sat watching them, eyes burning like twin lanterns in the darkness. Somehow it seemed ready, prepared, as if it had been waiting for this moment all along. At Harold's house. The journey to Harold's house felt like walking into a trap set by the universe itself. The old Victorian mansion stood like a skeleton under the pale moonlight, its windows hollow and lifeless, yet somehow watching them with unseen eyes. Vines curled along the broken fence, and the once bright garden had long since withered into brittle husks. Thomas felt the cold air shift the moment they crossed the threshold. It wasn't just a house, it was a prison of memories and dark intentions. Where would Harold have kept something like that? Thomas whispered. In his study, Father Edmund replied. Upstairs. But be careful. If the spirit's influence still lingers, it'll defend itself. The floorboards groaned under their feet as they climbed the winding staircase, every step a reminder of what was waiting for them at the top. The cat padded silently beside them, ears perked, every muscle tense. They reached the study door, which hung slightly ajar. Inside, the air smelled of dust, decay, and something metallic. Blood. The room was exactly as Harold had left it, shelves lined with old, crumbling books, papers strewn across the massive oak desk, and in the center, a black leather-bound book, its cover cracked and pulsing faintly as if it had a heartbeat of its own. There it is, Father Edmund whispered. The grimoire. Thomas stepped forward. But the temperature dropped sharply, his breath turning to frost. The shadows in the room twisted unnaturally, writhing like serpents. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind them. The whispers returned. Closer. Clearer this time. "You shouldn't have come." The voice wasn't Harold's. It was something far older. The shadows lunged, forming into clawed hands reaching for Thomas's throat. "Destroy the book," Father Edmund shouted, hurling holy water toward the shadows. The liquid sizzled on contact, burning the darkness away momentarily. Thomas grabbed the grimoire, its cold surface burning his skin like dry ice. The cat leapt forward, slashing at the shadow's tendrils with surprising ferocity, its eyes glowing like twin flames. "You can't stop me." The voice hissed through the room, echoing from every wall. "Harold let me in. Now I'll never leave." "Thomas," Father Edmund tossed a small silver dagger toward him. "Use this, it's been blessed." Without hesitation, Thomas drove the blade into the heart of the book. A scream, raw and inhuman, ripped through the house, shaking the very walls. The shadows recoiled violently, writhing as if they were burning from the inside out. The grimoire pulsed once, then split open, releasing a burst of blinding light that filled the room. Thomas shielded his eyes, and when the light faded, the shadows were gone. The book lay in ashes. The house was silent. The cat, now calm, brushed against Thomas's leg before settling peacefully at the foot of the desk. Father Edmund sank to his knees, exhausted but relieved. "It's over," he breathed. "The spirit is gone." Thomas wasn't so sure. As they turned to leave, his eyes lingered on the burned remnants of the grimoire. Somewhere deep in the silence, he could have sworn he heard a faint whisper. "For now." The house was eerily quiet now. No more whispers, no shifting shadows, just the cold emptiness of a place that had seen too much. Dust floated through the air like ash from a long-dead fire, settling over the remains of the grimoire, now nothing more than scorched fragments of ancient pages. Thomas stood in the center of the study, breath slow and heavy, every muscle in. His body ached from the tension that had gripped him since the graveyard. His hands trembled as he looked down at the dagger, now dulled and stained from whatever dark force it had pierced. The cat remained by his side, its eyes no longer glowing, but still watching him intently as if silently asking, "Is it truly over?" Father Edmund broke the silence first, his voice hoarse but steady. "We did it, Thomas. The book is destroyed, and the spirit, whatever it was, it's gone." Thomas nodded slowly but didn't feel the relief he'd expected. "Then why doesn't it feel finished?" The priest hesitated, his gaze distant. "Because evil doesn't vanish. It waits, and sometimes all it takes is a memory to bring it back." They left Harold's house behind, the cat following them closely as though it had found a new purpose beyond guarding the grave. The air outside felt fresher, as if the house had been holding its breath for years and was finally allowed to exhale. As they walked back toward the cemetery to ensure the grave remained sealed, Thomas found himself lost in thought. "What happens now?" he asked. Father Edmund looked up at the sky where dawn was just beginning to break, casting weak light over the horizon. "We watch, we remember, and we make sure no one else finds what Harold did." The cat let out a soft meow as if agreeing. When they reached the graveyard, they found the ground undisturbed. No signs of the clawed hand that had once reached for freedom. No lingering sense of dread. Just a simple gravestone, marked with Harold's name, standing in silent testament to the man's tragic choices. Thomas placed a hand on the cold stone, his voice barely a whisper. "I hope you found peace, Harold. For all our sakes." The priest nodded solemnly. If the spirit was truly bound to the book, then destroying it should have freed him. But if not, Thomas didn't let him finish the thought. Some things were better left unsaid. A few days later, life began to return to a semblance of normalcy, though the weight of what had happened still lingered. Thomas found himself unable to sleep without thinking of the whispers, the shadows, and Harold's haunted eyes and old photographs. The cat, now affectionately named Shadow, had taken up residence in Thomas's home. It followed him from room to room, always watching, always alert, as if ready for whatever might come next. One night, as Thomas sat by the window sipping tea and staring out at the moonlit sky, a soft knock echoed from the door. It was Father Edmund. His face was pale, eyes shadowed with exhaustion. "I found something," the priest said quietly, handing Thomas an old, faded letter. Thomas unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was unmistakable. Harold's. "If you're reading this, then I've failed to stop it. The darkness I tried to contain, it's older than anything we understand. I only hope that if the book is destroyed, it will end the cycle. But if it doesn't, burn the house. Every piece of it, only then will the curse truly be broken." Thomas's stomach twisted. "You think it's still not over?" Father Edmund shook his head. "The shadows have stopped, but that doesn't mean the curse is lifted. Harold's house, every memory, every trace of his research, needs to be destroyed." Thomas looked down at Shadow, who let out a low, mournful purr. The final chapter wasn't written yet, and the true resolution was still to come. The following day, Thomas and Father Edmund stood before Harold's house one last time. The sky was overcast, gray clouds swirling as if reflecting the storm inside Thomas's mind. In his hands he held the letter tightly, Harold's final plea weighing on him heavier than the thick, humid air. Shadow remained close by his side, tail flicking anxiously as if sensing the importance of what was about to happen. "We burn it all," Father Edmund said quietly, pouring a circle of salt around the house's perimeter, a final barrier to contain whatever lingering darkness might still cling to the old walls. No remnants, no memories, just ash. Thomas hesitated at the threshold. Every part of him ached with the weight of shared memories, of laughter, shared stories, and the quiet moments he and Harold had once enjoyed as close friends. Destroying the house felt like erasing Harold completely. But the deeper truth was clear. Harold was already gone. This house was no longer a sanctuary. It was a prison for whatever dark forces had consumed him. With a deep breath, Thomas lit the match. The flames caught quickly, devouring the brittle wood like a beast, finally. Freed from its chains, smoke curled toward the sky in thick black spirals, carrying the remnants of Harold's pain and mistakes with it. The windows shattered from the heat, and the house seemed to wail as the fire consumed every piece of his research, every page of his notes, every cursed memory left behind. Father Edmund whispered prayers under his breath, his voice steady even as the fire roared around them. Shadow sat beside Thomas, eyes fixed on the inferno with an understanding far too deep for any ordinary creature. As the flames reached their peak, Thomas felt the weight in his chest begin to lift. The house groaned one final time, collapsing, inward with a thunderous crash that sent embers flying into the dark sky. It was over. For the first time since Harold's death, the air felt lighter, clean. A week later, the town began to settle back into its quiet rhythm, the events of Harold's funeral fading into whispered rumors and half-remembered stories. But for Thomas, the scars lingered. He sat in his living room with Shadow curled in his lap, the letter from Harold resting on the table beside him. "Maybe now you're finally at peace," Thomas murmured, glancing out the window toward the space where Harold's house had once stood. Only a charred clearing remained, soon to be overtaken by grass and time. Father Edmund visited less frequently now, but whenever they crossed paths, there was a mutual understanding between them. A bond forged by shared loss and survival. One evening, the priest left Thomas with a parting thought. "Some spirits never leave us entirely, but sometimes it's not about forgetting, it's about learning to live with the memory." Thomas nodded silently, his hand resting gently on Shadow's soft fur. In the end, Harold's story wasn't just one of darkness and fear. It was a reminder of how obsession, even with the best intentions, can lead to tragedy. Some doors are better left unopened and some secrets should remain buried. But more than that, it was a story of redemption, of a friend who refused to let another's mistakes define the future, and a loyal guardian, in the form of a small gray cat, who stood against the creeping darkness. As Thomas sat beneath the stars, Shadow purring softly at his side, he realized that while the past could not be changed, the future was still unwritten. It was up to those left behind to honor the lessons learned, protect the fragile peace they had fought for, and carry the memory of those they had lost with quiet strength. Sometimes the bravest thing isn't fighting the darkness, it's choosing to move forward after the light has gone out. And in that simple act of survival, perhaps Harold's soul had finally found the peace it had so desperately sought.